Okay, so to kind of go back
Yep.
to the actual culture itself, and I think CI is just a good example because we're both from CI, so it's a lot easier for us to talk about it, and also a lot easier for our audience members to relate to the topic. But I know in CI, obviously the culture does still exist, right? Albeit in a slightly variated form. Obviously, it's not what we have exactly in typical Korean culture, Korean society, but it does exist. And so I wanted to kind of look at why it exists in CI, in a place like CI, which is an international school. Um, Actually, let's just start with that because I don't want to bombard you with questions. So, in order, firstly, why do you think this is a culture that exists in a place like CI?
Well, although CI is an international school that exists in Korea, most of the people that attend to this international school is from Korea and their nationality is Korean. So, like, what that means is that they grew up from a Korean society, from a Korean family, which, which means that since the parents of the Korean society teach their children, um, like on how to show respect to the upperclassman, like what we brought up like before. Uh, the parents teach the children how to use 존댓말, like which means like using formal words to upperclassman people. And I mean, just starting from that point, from being grown up from a Korean society or a Korean family, just makes it bigger and bigger, and just affects the society that the children lives in, which is CI.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think a lot of it has to do with um, obviously Korean students coming in, and they do form the majority of the student body. They have that um, this culture along with the other Korean cultures, typically Korean cultures, and it just kind of merges in with what we have in CI already. And I think obviously, once again, there are pros and cons to that. There are good aspects of it, there are bad aspects of it. Um, I To kind of give you my perspective, my take on the matter.
Yeah,
I am obviously the point of this interview is to try and stay as impartial as possible. But I think just for the sake of helping the audience to kind of see how I'm thinking about this issue, um,
yeah, yeah,
I have never gone to a Korean school. So I've been
Mm,
at CI since first grade. So I guess you could say I'm probably, even though I'm Korean, I'm not, I wasn't as exposed to Korean culture as a lot of other students who came from Korean schools or who came from other schools in Korea. Um, and so this kind of upperclassmen and underclassmen culture is really something that I learned from CI, from my time here at CI. And so obviously I have a slightly different perspective and a different understanding of it than um, Korean students. Because I've received a slightly different exposure. And I think personally, what I've always thought was that it is a, like you said, more positive than negative culture. And the reason I think that is because obviously, in a way, it's basically the system where the upperclassmen are respecting the the underclassmen are respecting the upperclassmen, which I think is totally fine. I think that is um, something that is ideal in any society, um, because inevitably there are going to be hierarchies in any society. And I think if there are going to be hierarchies, there might as well be respect between the people across the hierarchy. And obviously, the upperclassmen supporting and guiding the underclassmen is also great. I think that's very ideal. I've also received a lot of help from a lot of different upperclassmen throughout my years at CI, and it's definitely had a huge impact. Um, so I've always thought that it's more positive than negative. But what I am noticing is that it is changing, that the culture itself, not just at CI, but in Korea, is changing. And the way that it's changing is that people are starting to have a much more negative perspective on the issue. And what makes me think that is the um, the upperclassmen, I forget the term, the 꼰대 culture, right? I think the fact that that is a concept that exists obviously goes on to show two things. The first thing is that it shows there are upperclassmen or people of higher rank who exploit people, underclassmen, and people of a lower rank, social rank than them. And the second thing it shows is that sometimes, to look at it from a different perspective, there are underclassmen who like to exploit the system as well. And they do this by criticizing the upperclassmen of exploiting them. And I think so. I think it kind of goes both ways. So I don't know. I think would you say that um, it can go both ways, or do you think that it's predominantly more the upperclassmen exploiting underclassmen?
Well, yeah, I think you just brought up a good point. I mean, in the Korean society, like even in the gag shows or like the dramas that show up in Korean society from the TVs, it brings up the topic of 꼰대 culture, and they seem to criticize it like directly in front of everyone in the Korean society. And it is uh like the criticizing of the 꼰대 문화, or the 꼰대 culture is a thing now. It's like a meme for like the lower class workers in companies. And I think, yeah, just like what you said, I think that starts up the point of the lower class people exploiting like upper class people, sometimes more than how the upper class people does it to the lower class people, which makes it a problem uh into as my perspective. Um and I mean, just from that culture, just from the culture of criticizing the 꼰대 문화, makes it be able to say that it's a both way, uh just like what you said. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And the reason I bring this up is because obviously I've talked with a lot of different people before. I've talked with
Mm,
upperclassmen and underclassmen and also adults. And something that I hear very often, especially nowadays, especially recently, is people, whenever I'm talking with people who are, for example, holding a certain position within a group or within an organization, whether that's at a workplace or like a school club, for example, something that I hear very often is, oh, the members or the lower classmen don't really listen to what I say. Um,
mm,
and I know, for example, in the workplace, I think a very common culture that used to exist was, there's 부장님, which is, I guess,
yeah.
kind of like the head of that small subunit within the company. So until um, he or she, for example, leaves the workplace, everyone also needs to stay and work. There's kind of that type of culture, or when they tell you to let's go eat dinner, like 회식, then you have to go. Kind of, you know what I'm talking about, and I think a lot of Koreans will also be very familiar with this concept. But then nowadays, that's kind of changed. So it's like they'll say, "Oh, do I really have to go?" And then a lot of the cases they don't go, or they tag in early before the head.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that um, obviously from our perspective, it might seem very obvious, especially from an international perspective. It's like, what's wrong with that? But then I think because in Korean culture, that's something that's so deeply rooted into Korean culture that it can come off as very disrespectful or rude. And I think up to that point, where it's just seeming to be disrespectful and rude, that's fine. Because that's something that we need to change as a society. We need to change our mindset and our perspective on that. What I think can become a very important problem, and what I see becoming an a major problem, is that disrespect and rudeness that we are thinking is disrespectful and rude is starting to become actually disrespectful and rude.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important part of trying to understand this culture as well in the 21st century, is what line should we not cross? And that obviously, like you said, goes both ways, upperclassmen and underclassmen. How much is too much? How much is being a konde? And how much is being disrespectful, right? And I do realize that our time is almost up. So do you have any final remarks or any final comments that you'd like to make? Or, if you have a question that you'd like to ask me about the topic, that's also fine.
Well, I mean, the last discussion that you brought up seems like fantastic to me, because in this discussion, if you only talked about like the Gunde Muna and how it's like and how it might be negative towards our society, it might have just been a one-sided discussion. But since you just brought up uh the line that the lower class people like us shouldn't cross to show disrespect to the higher class people, I think the way that you brought up that topic um made us talk about both ways. And I mean, in my perspective, just to finish off, I think just like what you said, in the 21st century, uh, now in the time of South Korean society, the lower class people are seeming to like, I'm not sure how to like show this, but like uh, climb the hierarchy more than what they should be climbing. So like, I think the people of the lower class are kind of crossing the line towards the higher class people, just by saying that, oh, you guys are konde, and like just by criticizing the konde muna, they think that they have the right, or they think that they have the opportunity to like cross the lines and show disrespect towards what the higher class people want them to do, or like what they think. And I think that makes it a bit of a problem of the Korean society, or any society around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, our discussion, it's really just to provoke the thoughts of our audience. We're not saying definitively that anything is better
Yeah.
or worse or true or false. But yeah, that's definitely something that we need to think more about. Personally, I've always been someone who's thought that skills should be a priority in terms of
Yeah.
judging or like positions. Whoever's most skilled obviously gets the position. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time. Thank you for joining us today. I think we had a very wonderful discussion. I hope the audience, I'm sure the audience got a lot from today's interview. And do you have anything else you'd like to
No,
say
it's
to our
fine.
audience?
Well, thank you for listening to our discussion, and thank you again, Sihun, for inviting me to this discussion. And I think it was very fruitful for us to bring up a lot of topics about this culture in Korea.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.